The sound came at night, quiet at first, not a howl or a storm, or even a boot step in the wrong place. It was the faintest scuttling, like claws brushing stone, but it wasn't the noise that made Ella freeze in the middle of pulling on her wool socks by candlelight. It was her husband's hand, stiff, still, mid-motion, gripping the loaded rifle as if he already knew where that sound would end. They'd lived through too many winters not to know the start of something bad. And when the sound came again, closer, under the floorboards, Boone turned his eyes slowly to her, not saying a word. That silence between them was louder than anything else in the room. It was their third year in the southern draw below Buffalo Pass. Land not good enough for gold diggers or cattle barons, but just dry and dusty enough to make a man think he could build a life if he worked hard enough. Their neighbors, if you could call them that, were 3 miles north, another couple who hadn't been seen since the first snow hit, and the trapper's line ran 7 miles west along the creek. The world was empty otherwise, all wind and dust and things you couldn't see until they got too close. And now something was moving under the floor. Boone didn't get up right away. He didn't aim. He just sat still, every line in his weather-cut face pulled tight like rope drying on a post. Ella saw the sweat starting at his temple, despite the chill. Then, carefully, he laid the rifle aside. Not because he thought they were safe, because he knew it wouldn't help. That was the night everything started to change. The winter they learned their strange little habit with the mud wasn't useless after all. But back before that, before the snow, before the floor creaked at night, before the boots rotted from the inside out, they were just another stubborn pair of fools trying to make something last in a place that didn't want them. Boone had been a stonemason's son who hated the trade. He was wiry, slow to speak, but his hands were big, scarred and calloused, like he could crack boulders with them if you gave him a reason. Ella had been a preacher's daughter from Arkansas, half feral by the time she turned 18 from chasing after hogs and dragging firewood with her little brothers while her mama died slow of fever. They met one summer along the Chisholm Trail when he saved her from a runaway mule cart. She married him 3 weeks later because he didn't talk much, and that, to her, was worth more than gold. Together they headed west and found a patch of land so dry the grass gave up trying. But there was a well, shallow but clean, and enough sun to grow beans and pumpkins if you begged the Lord hard enough. That first year they built everything by hand. No sawmill, no nails, just what they could whittle or wedge or pack, and they packed a lot of mud. That became Ella's thing. Every cabin wall, every fence post base, every stone hearth got smeared and sealed in thick, wet layers of clay mud. She dug herself from the gully just past the thorn oaks. Neighbors, when there were any, would laugh, said she looked like a swamp witch playing pretend bricklayer, said the mud would crack in summer and melt in winter, said rats would chew straight through anyway. But Ella didn't stop. She'd mix straw in with it, even hair sometimes, hers or the goats, and she'd press it around every seam like she was sealing something sacred. And Boone didn't argue, not even once, maybe because he knew what she didn't say. That first winter, she'd woken up with a field mouse in her hair. The second winter, it had been a bigger thing, something grey and twitching and full of hunger that left wet marks near the baby's cradle they never got to use. That baby never made it to February. No, Boone didn't argue about the mud. They used it for everything. She sealed the pantry tight with it. He even packed the outhouse posts with it. When they built a second storage lean-to, she smeared the underside of the roof with it until it looked like a nest built by humans who forgot they weren't animals. But the truth was, Boone and Ella had survived longer than any of the other settlers who'd tried the same patch of land. A lot longer. Even when the windstorms came. Even when the coyotes ran down from the hills and tore up every chicken. Even when the termites devoured the bean trellises and the water turned to silt. Their cabins stayed standing. Their pantries stayed stocked. Their legs stayed moving. So when the floorboards made that sound, when something in the dark made Boone set down his gun, they knew it wasn't just a mouse. The next morning they found the shredded bits of grain sack beneath the pantry trapdoor. Not torn, gnawed. The little hole in the plank floor wasn't there the night before, and it wasn't small. Ella knelt beside it, holding up the lantern, and what she saw made her skin crawl like her blood knew something. Her brain hadn't figured out yet. The gnaw marks were wet, fresh, and the bite radius wasn't right. Boone dropped to one knee and didn't say a thing. He touched the wood edge once, then stood and grabbed the hatchet. No panic, just a look that said, "We ain't sleeping again till this is fixed." The trapdoor lifted and the stench came up so fast Ella had to turn her face. Wet rot, sour meat, old rain, and something else. Something warm. It wasn't a cellar. It was barely a crawl space, just 6 feet by 4 carved into the earth with timber bracing and a dirt floor. They stored potatoes down there sometimes, firewood too, but today there was nothing but hollow space, disturbed earth, and a tunnel. A tunnel, wide enough for a dog, long enough they couldn't see where it ended. Ella's hand went to her mouth. Boone didn't move. He just stared down that hole like it had personally insulted him. Then he turned and pointed to the mud. Pale. By the time evening came, they'd sealed off that tunnel opening with not just planks, but thick, hand-mixed layers of clay, packed so tight Ella's shoulders ached for hours. But they didn't stop. Every weak seam in the floor was plastered, every beam checked. Boone went outside and reinforced the corner posts with fresh stone and more of Ella's cursed mud until the place looked like a half-sunk ruin. And that night, they didn't sleep. They just listened. The scratching came back, but not from below. It was in the walls now. Something didn't like being sealed out. Ella gripped the rifle this time, not because she thought it would help, but because it felt better than praying. It got worse after that. They found a hole chewed through the corner of the lean-to, then the coop fence. Then, on the third day, the rain barrel. Thick oak slats, torn like paper. They never saw anything, not once. But Boone started setting traps, big ones, steel ones, meant for wolves. Nothing ever tripped them, but every night the sounds got closer, louder, inside, outside, beneath and above. Boone started reinforcing the cabin like a fortress, every corner packed, every board double-nailed, every floor crack filled with Ella's mud. He even smeared it inside the hearth and up the chimney flue. They used so much mud it dried gray and flaked into powder when touched. The house looked like it had been buried and clawed its way back out. And somehow, it worked. 2 nights passed with no sound, then 3, then a week, and just when Ella let herself believe it was over, they found what had been living under the floorboards, and what it had left behind. It started with a smell again, not a dead smell. They'd both known too many of those. Boone once spent 4 days helping bury cholera victims in Kansas, and Ella had carried the bloated body of her little brother across 2 counties to find a grave that hadn't frozen shut. No, this wasn't rot. It was sweet, wet, and wrong, like fresh-cut melon left too long in the sun, or a chicken egg cracked open to find something moving inside. It came up through the hearth vent. Ella noticed it first while boiling beans. She dropped the ladle when she leaned too close and nearly vomited. Boone came in from chopping wood and halted mid-step, his nose flaring, jaw clenching so tight it popped. They didn't say a word. Both of them moved like they already knew what they'd find. Boone pulled the grate free from the hearth's base. Ella lit the lantern, and there, inside the ash chute, something glistened. At first it looked like fat, white, curved lumps the size of a man's thumb, buried halfway in ash. Boone reached in with the fireplace tongs and pulled one out. Not fat, eggs. Ella's knees buckled. Boone caught her with one hand and yanked her back before she touched the side of the chute. The walls were moving, barely, subtle enough to miss unless you stared, but moving they were, twitching, pulsing, like the stone had veins. He slammed the chute shut and jammed the iron poker through the handles. Then he poured half a kettle of scalding water down through the grate until the room hissed with steam. The sound that came back up wasn't steam, not entirely. It was a hiss, not air, not water, but breath. Boone backed up slow, not from fear, but calculation, and Ella, still trembling, knelt and pulled the sack of dried sage from the mantel. She didn't ask, she just handed it to him. The second kettle went down with the sage, then pine resin, then mud, packed by hand and smeared so thick across the chute it took both of them to seal it in place. Boone pulled iron nails from a broken horseshoe and drove them in, one by one, until that vent looked like it had been closed since the Revolution. That was the night they didn't light the fire, and still the warmth lingered, as if something down below was giving off heat now. Boone didn't sleep that night. He sat in the rocking chair, rifle across his lap, staring at the hearth. In the morning, the eggs were gone. So was the ash. Boone unsealed the vent just enough to peek, empty, scraped clean, like something had licked the stone bare. Ella retched again, just thinking of it. But Boone, stoic as ever, only said one thing. "We dig." She didn't ask what he meant, didn't have to. He meant the old crawl space, the place where this had started. Boone made her wait outside the cabin that morning, said he'd do it alone, said her lungs were too bad from last winter's coughing. Truth was, he didn't want her to see what he expected to find. But Ella didn't stay put long. She waited until the sun reached the pine cross above the coop, about an hour, then wrapped her shawl tight and followed the dragging sounds around back. The trapdoor lay open. Boone stood waist-deep in the hole, shovel working slow, careful strokes. The tunnel had widened. What used to be a crawl space was now nearly a den, half the size of their kitchen. And carved into the sides, not dug, not crumbled, were burrows, perfect, round holes, dozens of them. Not one showed claw marks. These had been worn smooth, rubbed, like something had slid through them, again and again, and the mud she'd packed days ago, all gone, peeled away like fruit skin. She stepped closer. "Boone!" He didn't look up. "They're building." Her stomach turned. "Building what?" Boone stopped digging. Then he did look up. Home. By evening, they'd emptied the woodpile to reinforce the crawlspace entrance. Boone laid timbers, sealed with mud and ash, then added old pitch tar from a forgotten pine stump he'd kept for lantern work. Ella helped fit the seams. She didn't speak once. Her hands worked in rhythm, fast, smooth, slapping clay over cracks like she was born doing it. But her mind was drifting, back to that first year, when the rats had chewed into their flour sack and eaten enough to bloat and die in the corner behind the stove. Boone had said, "We ain't feeding nothing we can't name," and they'd trapped the rest. Easy enough. But these weren't rats. They weren't mice. They weren't anything that made sense. And that night, the wind carried the smell again. Sweeter this time. Closer. Hot and full. Like breath on the neck. Ella sat upright in bed. The smell wasn't coming from the hearth anymore. It was coming under the door. She swung her legs off the bed. Boone was already moving. No words, no shoes. Just rifle and breath. The cabin door was sealed, bolted, but the scent bled through the seams, thick enough to taste. Boone's face hardened. He turned, not to the door, but to the corner of the pantry. Ella followed his eyes, and froze. The mud, the thick clay seal they'd used to cover the pantry floor seam. It was moving, bubbling, as if something underneath was breathing out. She grabbed the lantern. Then the floor bulged. A soft rise, like something under a blanket, lifting. Boone didn't shout, didn't shoot. He dropped the rifle, grabbed the hatchet, and swung. The floor cracked. Mud exploded outward. And what came out wasn't a rat. It had the shape of one. Long body, grey skin, but no fur, no eyes. Just a face like wet bark, peeling, twitching. Its mouth wasn't a mouth, just a round ring of teeth like oyster shells, gnashing in silence. Boone drove the hatchet down again, and again the thing writhed, screamed, but not out loud. It was inside their heads. Ella dropped to her knees, hands to her ears, teeth clenched against the pressure. She felt the sound behind her eyes, like something was squeezing her skull. Then Boone crushed it. One last swing. The thing burst like a sack of eggs, and silence fell, for a moment. Then under the floor, the pantry, the hearth, the crawl space, came the scraping. Dozens, no, hundreds. Boone looked at her. They've been nesting. They sealed the hole before dawn. Not with boards, not with nails, with mud, thicker, deeper, stronger than before. Ella brought water from the well, mixed it with ash, salt, and straw. Boone shoveled it in, bare hands, until his nails bled. Then they did the walls, again the ceiling joints, again the windows, the floor seams, even the chimney, sealed shut. And still the sounds came, the scuttling, the wet dragging, the breathing, but they couldn't get in, not anymore. That's when Ella realized something. They weren't just surviving because of the mud, they were winning because of it. The others who'd vanished, the neighbors who stopped sending smoke signals, the trapper who never passed by again, they hadn't had mud walls, they hadn't packed their cabins like tombs, they hadn't treated the earth like an enemy that could crawl inside. Boone said it out loud one night, as he watched the candle burn low. "You built us a second skin," and she had, and it held. Even when the spring came, even when the things beneath the earth went silent, even when the last trap Boone set finally caught something he didn't show her, he buried it in the woods without a word. But afterward, he smeared mud on the shovel and never left it out again. The thaw came hard that year, the kind that doesn't feel like mercy, just the next threat in a different form. The creek flooded once the snow melted off the pass, snapping the bridge planks and nearly drowning the chicken coop under grey slush. Ella hauled water in boots 3 sizes too big, stepping over ankle-deep mud to save what few roots had survived beneath the lean-to. Boone didn't talk much anymore. He spent more time staring at the ground than the sky, checking for tracks that shouldn't be there, checking the base of trees for claw marks no one else would have noticed. The wind changed direction every day. Some mornings smelled like wet soil and pine bark. Others brought it back, that warm, syrupy scent that didn't belong to anything alive or decent. But the scratching stopped, and Boone started digging again. Not because he wanted to find anything, but because he had to be sure. Every new thaw exposed another weakness in the earth, and Boone wouldn't let a single hollow go unchecked. He'd slam his shovel down and listen, wait for echo, then pack the space with stone, ash, and Ella's clay, sealing every pocket like it held plague. And one morning, He came to her with something wrapped in his coat. She was stitching up a flour sack on the porch when she looked up and saw the look on his face. He didn't speak, just unwrapped the bundle slow and held it out. A piece of old timber, weathered, chewed. On the side was a smear of hardened clay. Ella's mix, still there after all winter, still holding, but on the other side was a tooth, not a rat's, not a coyote's. It was too long, curved like a fishhook but flat along one side, almost surgical, bone white with a yellow ring near the root, and something like tiny serrations down the edge. Ella reached for it, but Boone flinched, just slightly. She stopped, met his eyes. "You think it's sick?" she asked. Boone didn't answer right away. He knelt down, touched the tooth's edge with the back of his fingernail. "Don't feel natural," he said. She stared at it another moment, then stood, walked to the old fire pit, and threw the whole bundle in. They didn't burn trash often, fuel was precious, but that morning Boone poured oil on the fire and didn't look away as the flames turned green and purple for one brief second before settling. They didn't speak of it again. The weather turned warm, faster than usual, and for the first time since settling there, their spring crop took root strong and early. Beans sprouted deep green. The onions didn't bolt. The squash leaves fanned out wide and healthy, untouched by bugs or birds. Ella swore the air tasted different, richer somehow. Boone joked, in his way, that maybe the things underground had left them a blessing on their way out. She didn't laugh, but she didn't stop planting either. For weeks, it felt like the worst had passed. The ground held, the traps stayed empty, the mud seals didn't crack, even under direct sun. Boone added a second layer to the pantry just in case, and Ella reinforced the corners with old bones soaked in ash, a trick she'd learned from her grandmother to ward off snakes, though she didn't say what it was really for now. They even had a visitor, the first in almost a year, a traveling peddler named Virgil, headed north with a mule cart of cast-iron goods. He asked if they needed anything. Boone said no. Ella hesitated, then traded a bag of dried squash for a new oil lantern and some coarse soap. Virgil stayed only an hour. He refused to step into the cabin, said he didn't like the smell, said the house made his skin itch. Ella watched him leave with a tightening in her gut she couldn't name. The next morning, the mud was cracked, not crumbling from heat, cracked, split down the center of the west wall, clean as a knife wound. Boone ran his fingers along the seam. No moisture inside. No signs of claw or tooth, just a split, like something had flexed from behind, gently, just once. Ella sealed it again that afternoon, but she knew something had changed, and that night Boone dreamed again. He woke coughing, shaking, soaked through the sheets. He didn't speak, just sat up and stared at the wall until the sun rose. Ella pressed a hand to his shoulder. "What was it?" He swallowed, voice hoarse. "They was watching me from inside the walls. I could hear 'em thinking." She didn't ask what they were thinking. She already knew. 2 weeks later, the trapdoor was open. They kept it sealed, always. Boone had reinforced it with an iron latch, bent nails, and a mud-packed bar. Ella had even carved a warding symbol her mother taught her into the wood, a circle with 4 pointed arms meant to keep disease and vermin at bay. But that morning, the bar lay broken beside the hatch. The door gaped, and the hole was gone. Not sealed, not collapsed. Gone, clean, as if someone had come in with hands and tools and erased the entire crawl space. Boone dropped to his knees and stared into the square. Only dirt. Ella stepped closer, lantern raised. No tunnel, no teeth, no smell, but the walls, smooth, too smooth, and in one corner, half buried under loose earth, was a small pile, 6 tiny bones, arranged in a circle. Boone stared, then quietly shut the hatch. He sealed it that day with more mud than ever before. Then he nailed a crossbeam over it, poured pitch down the sides, and packed stones on top until the trapdoor rose above the rest of the floor like a burial mound. They stopped using the pantry, moved the food to the lean-to, reinforced it too. Ella packed that whole thing with clay so thick you could hit it with a hammer and not make a dent. And still, she didn't sleep, not soundly, because she started hearing the sound again, not scuttling, scratching, writing, as if something was dragging a nail or a tooth across wood, spelling things that only the dark could understand. Boone didn't hear it at first, but he saw the marks. They appeared at the window frame, thin gouges curved like letters but not letters. Boone scraped them off, resealed the frame. They came back, in the lean-to this time, then the inside of the door frame, then finally on the rafters, above their bed. Boone carved them out in silence, but his hands trembled more each time. And one night he sat up and whispered to Ella, "It ain't marks, it's messages." She stared at him. "What do they say?" He didn't answer. But the next morning, he burned the bed frame, built a new one with no wood from the house. Ella didn't argue. She just packed the new bed legs with clay. That summer, things changed. No rats came. No birds nested near the cabin. No coyotes crossed their line. No ants. No beetles. Nothing. It was quiet. Too quiet. The land seemed to avoid the cabin. Grass died in a ring around it, 10 feet out, like the soil didn't want to grow anymore. Even the wind bent around the structure, like it didn't want to press against the walls. And still, the mud held. Neighbors, what few remained in the distant hills, started asking questions. Word had spread somehow about the couple with no vermin, no rot, no mold in the root cellar, no snakes, no black widow spiders, not even flies. One man rode out to see it himself, said his wife was desperate, something chewing through their roof beams, and no one believed her. Boone let him walk the perimeter. The man left in less than 10 minutes, didn't say a word, didn't come back. Ella found a small pouch beside the gate the next morning. Inside was a lock of baby's hair and a copper button. She burned them without asking Boone, just like the others that came after, because word kept spreading and people wanted their secret. By autumn, Ella had packed every wall 3 times. Some sections were nearly 6 inches thick: clay, straw, ash, bone dust, and old pine pitch. Boone started carving runes into the posts, not real ones, just marks that felt right. He didn't know what they meant, but he said his hands knew. Ella let him, and when she laid in bed that night, she realized something had changed again. Not just outside, but inside. The cabin felt alive, not in a monstrous way, not breathing, not hungry, but aware, like the walls remembered everything, everything they'd suffered, everything they'd survived, and everything they'd buried. It had been a year since the first sound came under the floorboards, and by the start of that second winter, Boone and Ella lived in a house that no longer resembled what they'd built by hand. It stood low to the ground now, hunchbacked under the weight of layer upon layer of mud-packed protection. The walls were mottled with streaks of ash, bone white in some corners, and rust dark in others, stained by time and something else. The windows had shrunk, not by design, but by Ella's endless patchwork of clay and pine pitch meant to seal every draft. Boone had shaved the door thinner just to get it to open and close without scraping against the growing wall edges. The cabin no longer welcomed light. It braced against it, like a body prepared to endure something it couldn't name. No neighbors had visited in months, not since midsummer, when a preacher from down near Elk Hollow came riding up with talk of holy protection and soil-blessed purity. Boone didn't let him pass the stump post. The man smelled of perfume oil and soft paper. Boone said the earth didn't like that kind of smell. The preacher laughed. Then he walked around back and leaned too close to the sealed chimney flue, whispering something. The chimney wept that night. Not smoke, not water. A thick yellow slime that smelled like sour milk and lantern soot. Boone buried the preacher's hat, found beside the coop fence the next morning. Ella never asked where the man went. She never saw him again. By mid-November, the signs began returning. Not sounds, not yet, but marks. Gouges in the lintels, narrow as threads, circles on the undersides of the table legs, tiny holes that appeared in a line across the lean-to ceiling, each the size of a thumbprint and filled with dust, packed like nests. Then one day, Ella found the bone pile. It was behind the cabin, under the edge of the storm shelter Boone had dug in their second year, a small mound of gnawed scraps, white and clean. Not animal bones, not quite. Too long, too thin. One had knuckle ridges, but too many joints. Another curved like a rib, but ended in a point. She called Boone. He didn't speak, just stared down at them. Then, wordless, he brought the shovel. They buried them far off in the dead meadow, where even grass refused to grow. But Boone poured ash into the hole before he laid the bones in, then salt, then sealed it with clay the way Ella had taught him. And that night, for the first time in weeks, the wind screamed. Not howled, screamed. Ella held her shawl tight around her neck and prayed. Not to the God she was raised with. That one hadn't answered when her baby stopped breathing 2 winters ago. No, she prayed to the earth, to the walls, to the packed mud that remembered her hands. She prayed it would hold, and it did, for a while. Boone started waking up with scratches on his arms. Not deep, but patterned. 5 thin lines down the forearm, always in the same place. Then across the chest, then the ankles. He didn't cry out. Boone had never been one to make noise. But Ella saw the change in his eyes. Not fear, not even anger, recognition, something he'd seen before. Ella searched the bed frame, the linens, the ceiling above. Nothing, no signs, no cracks in the wall, no tracks on the floor. But the next night, the scratches appeared on her too. Boone sealed the bedroom window the next morning, not with mud this time, but with bricks. Where he found them, she didn't ask, but he stacked them by hand, one by one, and then Ella packed the seams until no air could move through. They began sleeping in shifts, and on the 4th night of the storm, It returned, the scratching, but this time from inside the walls. Boone froze. Ella didn't breathe. It moved around them, a slow, dragging whisper that traced the outer rim of the bedroom, rising higher along the walls with each pass. It didn't hurry. It took its time. Then came the scent, sweet, hot, rot. Boone lit the lantern, and the light didn't reach the corners. The shadows writhed. Ella stood, despite the cold and her shaking hands, and walked barefoot to the hearth. She knelt, peeled back the edge of the old ash-packed grate, and reached into the darkness. She pulled out a lump of clay, her mix, still cold, still firm, still ready. She handed it to Boone, and for hours they packed the walls again. Not just the cracks, not just the seams. Every inch. They smeared the walls like a child smearing blood on a shrine, fast and wild and desperate. And the scratching stopped. Not faded, stopped, mid-movement. Like something realized it had been noticed. Ella collapsed after. Not from exhaustion, from release. She didn't know what she'd been holding in her chest for months, maybe years, but whatever had been coiled there, tight and hot and waiting, loosened, and for the first time since the baby died, she cried. Boone held her until dawn. The lantern burned dry. The walls were still. They kept to themselves after that. Boone stopped setting traps. Ella stopped planting vegetables beyond the line where the grass died. The garden shrank. The coop held only 2 chickens. They spent more time tending the mud than the food, because the food would rot, but the walls remembered. Ella started talking to the walls, not like a madwoman, not out loud in public, but when she was alone, while she mixed clay or mended cracks. She'd whisper things into the plaster, not questions, confessions, regrets, gratitudes. She told the walls about her mother, about the child she lost, about how Boone still made her laugh once a week, and that was enough. She told them about the preacher and the peddler and the baby hair in the pouch, and when she did, the house stopped creaking and stayed warm. Boone began to do the same in his own way. He started carving again, but not in wood. He etched into the outer layers of mud itself, strange symbols, half-remembered things from dreams, circles inside triangles, sharp vertical lines bisected by wavy slashes. At first, Ella had worried, but then she noticed, when he finished carving, the wind stopped howling. The cold didn't get through, so she let him continue. She even started adding her own, not symbols, shapes, a curl for the baby's breath, a leaf for her mother, a tiny sun for Boone, a seed, and the house changed. It felt deeper, not larger, but heavier, rooted, like a tree grown in reverse, its strength beneath the ground. No one else came. They didn't want them to. The world had forgotten the cabin, but the cabin had not forgotten them. Late that winter, when the ice came and broke half the valley's fences, and froze the river solid enough to trap fish beneath the ice, Boone and Ella sat by a candle and listened, not for scuttling, not for clawing, but for absence. It was gone, all of it, the scratching, the smells, the cold, the warping dreams. In its place, silence, and the crackling of mud as it dried and hardened into bone. Ella took Boone's hand. "We made it," she said. He didn't reply, but his hand tightened. Then he looked toward the wall, and for just a second, no longer, they both thought they saw it move, not bulge, not shift, move, like breath, rising through clay lungs. Ella stood, walked to the wall, pressed her palm against it. The surface was warm. She smiled. "Still with us," she whispered, and she meant it. Not a threat, not a warning, but a promise. Because whatever had tried to come through the earth had met something older, older than pests, older than men. It had met a house built by hands that remembered, hands that pressed mud not just for shelter, but for protection, for memory. And the thing beneath the floorboards? It had learned, you don't claw through a house like that. You respect it, or it seals you in forever. By spring of the following year, the world beyond Boone and Ella's cabin had changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. Not in the sense of towns growing or railroads cutting through the hills, but in how the land behaved. South of them, the abandoned McClary homestead lay rotted in the dust. The roof had collapsed inward from snowmelt, the hearth black with soot and clawed through beneath. To the west, the trapper's line Boone used to follow had vanished entirely. The snares rusted in the open, bones scattered where boots hadn't passed in over a year. But their cabin remained, not untouched. No, it bore scars, deep ones, mud walls crisscrossed with years of urgent plasterwork, hasty layers packed on panic, clay still dark where it was wet with last week's storm. But it stood tall, or rather, low and wide like a buried creature, eyes just beneath the surface, watching. Boone no longer checked for fresh claw marks each morning. Ella no longer waited to hear scuttling underfoot. Something had settled, and though they would never say it aloud, not to each other and not even to themselves, they both felt it. The war was over, for now. That spring, the mud needed less tending. It held its shape longer. It didn't flake under sun or soften under rain. Boone said the walls had learned how to live here. Ella didn't correct him. She knew what he meant, what had begun. as frantic defense had become something else. Integration, inheritance. They had shaped the house, and the house, in return, had shaped them. Boone began carving again, this time with purpose. He no longer scratched desperate runes into the clay by candlelight. Now he took time, measured lines, gentle curves, spirals, concentric circles, hands, always hands, layered into the inner walls. He said nothing while working, but Ella watched him sometimes, standing in the doorway with a bowl of beans cooling in her palms, and she noticed something different in his posture, less wary, more reverent. She asked him once, "What are you drawing?" Boone looked up, fingers stained with earth. "Maps," he said, "of what we don't see," and she understood. There were spaces beneath them now, not just tunnels, not burrows, but corridors, hallways where no light reached, where the things that once scratched and clawed now slithered silent, respectful, unwilling to test the walls again, because the mud remembered, and because Ella had sealed it all with care, and Boone had drawn the boundary lines in symbols too old for words. They had, without planning, built something sacred, not a fortress, a warning. That summer another visitor came, not the preacher, not a peddler, a boy, maybe 16, maybe 20, thin as split wood, and covered in dust. His horse had died 2 miles back. He said nothing about it, just stumbled up to the cabin, eyes hollow, lips cracked, hands shaking. Ella stepped out first. Boone stayed in the doorway, watching. The boy didn't speak at first, just stared at the walls. Then he whispered, "They told me, this place don't let 'em in." Ella offered him water. He took it with both hands, desperate but careful. She waited, and finally he said, "They come at night now, climb right up into the roof beams. I tried fire, I tried salt. Mama said the roots under our house was cursed." His eyes began to blur. "She didn't make it through the last frost. Papa either. I buried 'em in the barn 'cause it was too loud in the house." Ella didn't ask what had been making the noise. She stepped aside. "Come in then." The boy hesitated, but when he passed the threshold, his shoulders dropped, like a burden lifted. Boone didn't blink, didn't smile, just stepped back and closed the door. The cabin held. The boy stayed 3 days, said little, ate what Ella gave him, slept on the floor beside the hearth without fear. Boone showed him how to pack clay with ash, how to seal a corner with tight spirals of straw soaked in lard. Ella handed him her own carving knife, dulled smooth from years of use. "You'll need it," she said, "but not here." When he left, Boone gave him a bag of mix, dry clay, salt, straw fibers, and bits of chalk. He called it starter. Ella kissed the back of his hand, and before he disappeared down the ridge trail, he turned once, eyes wide, and asked, "Is it true that the mud remembers?" Ella didn't answer directly. She just said, "Only if you listen while you lay it," and the boy nodded, then vanished into the morning dust. The seasons passed. Each year someone else found their way there, never more than one at a time. Some came in desperation, pale and hunted, eyes sunken from nights without sleep. Others came with questions, rumors caught in the wind about a cabin too low to the ground, too quiet for the animals, too warm in the freeze. Boone never welcomed them, but he never turned them away. Ella showed them how to mix. She didn't give sermons. She gave work, hands in the earth, palms in the straw, press and smear, layer and smooth. Some cried while doing it, others whispered into the plaster. One old woman wept silently while pressing her dead daughter's necklace into a beam before covering it in clay. Boone let it be. No names were exchanged, no promises made. But when each visitor left, they took something with them, and they left something behind, a mark in the wall, a token pressed into the foundation, a strand of hair braided into a mud seam, and the house grew heavier, wiser. Ella never wrote it down, but she came to understand something clear. Every story shared into the walls stayed there, and those stories watched. They didn't judge, they didn't warn, they simply remained, waiting for the next story. Boone grew slower. His hands didn't hold the hatchet the way they once did, but he could still press mud, could still carve. Even when his back twisted and his legs gave him grief, he'd sit on the porch and chisel into old boards, turning waste wood into warnings. Ella grew stiffer. Her knees ached in the cold, but she still mixed clay with her hands, even when the water chilled her bones. She said the cold was part of the pact, pain for protection. She never feared it, because fear had no place inside those walls. Only memory did, and the walls bore the memories of things older than fear, older than teeth, older than rot. One night, years later, the scratching returned. Not faint, not subtle, clear, slow, calculated. Ella sat upright in bed. Boone didn't move. He was still, too still. She leaned close. He wasn't breathing. No pain on his face. No sign of struggle, just peace, and the scratching behind the wall, like a final visitor arriving too late. Ella rose, took the lantern, walked to the west wall, Boone's favorite place to carve. She pressed her palm against the surface. It was warm, and she said quietly, "He's gone." The scratching stopped, for good. She buried Boone at dawn, not in the dirt, in the wall. She built a new layer, 10 inches thick, reinforced with dried sage, pine tar, straw, and ash. She pressed his hat into the center, then the carving knife, then the little sun she'd made from clay all those years ago, and she packed it with bare hands, no gloves, until her nails bled. And when it was sealed, the house shifted. Not a sound, a settling, like a book closing. Ella leaned against it and whispered, "You held." And she meant all of it. The cabin, the mud, the man, the memory. They still talk about that place. The house too low to the ground, the walls too thick to explain, the rooms that smelled not of dust or mold, but of iron and something like incense. They say it's a curse. They say it's a grave. They say the woman who lived there was half mad and half witch, and didn't speak a word for the last 5 years of her life. But the ones who know, the ones who listened, they remember that the mud was never just mud. It was memory made solid, and memory was the strongest wall of all. They say rodents never entered that cabin again. Not mice, not rats, not anything with teeth, because those walls held more than clay. They held a story, and no creature, not even the ones beneath the earth, dares claw through a story that still breathes.